déjenme que primero me asegure que quienes necesitan interpretación en
For
inglés
those who need interpretation in English, we hope you're listening.
or you have some technical issue, please let us know via the chat. Antes de comenzar algunas notas logísticas.
Before we begin, this conversation is being recorded. We will later share it on our webpage. If anyone does not want their words to be recorded, we don't have any problem with, just let us know, send a message, and you can advise us if you don't want to share any part of what we're discussing here today. We can remove it. Also, if you have any technical problems or issues, please don't hesitate to write to us in the chat. So with that, I think we've covered all of the initial technical parts, and now I can welcome you to this talk about the social and political processes that Chile is going through currently. They're moving towards a new constitution. This is an intensely participatory process that may create a new framework for constitutions that will be environmentalist, feminist, and include the original peoples. My name is Luciana Berkovic. I'm part of the legal empowerment team. It's a network of organizations that seek to improve the lives of people and the ways of developing policy and politics. If anyone who would like to know more about the network, we'll include a link in the chat. We have materials principally in Spanish, some is translated into English. And there's also a WhatsApp group in Spanish for those members of the network. I'd like to begin to say briefly how this conversation arose. Some time ago, we had our annual course, which is on legal leadership and empowerment, that people participate with all different methodologies and for empowerment, legal empowerment of communities. These were two very intense weeks of learning and collective conversations. And in that framework, on one of the conversations about gender empowerment, talked about the process. A colleague of ours from Bangladesh who's with us here today said something about, wow, what's happening in Chile is really amazing. I wish we could know more about. So this is how this came about. So we have with us members of environmentalist organizations that are participating in the process in Chile. It's very interesting to meet people from other regions, be able to ask directly questions, learn about what's happening in that context. And we hope we can all draw a little bit of hope from this process and this experience. What they've done is magic. It's brought us together here today with those who are forming part of this process, those who will be part of the constitutional group. So many thanks for opening up this possibility for us. From our end, it seemed interesting for two principal reasons. One, in such a dark moment, so driven by authoritarianism in so many parts of the world, to be acquainted with experiences in which people are making a really living exercise of their rights, where there's the whole community is launching itself into a process that is so intensely transformative. It inspires a lot of hope, and we hope to share this experience and this inspiration. Second, because we are a legal empowerment network, and the real dream of legal empowerment is exactly what's happening in Chile right now. Something so driven by direct popular participation, in which the people really will define the new legal framework for the country. This is a structural and systemic change, making use of law on behalf of communities. And so I will be moderating the conversation. for those who are with us, if you have any any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to write them into the chat, and we will pose them to the participants. Later, we will open up a space for direct conversation between the participants. So first, I will pass the floor to Encio Costa, who's the executive director of the NGO FEMA, which has led the Ecological Constitution campaign. And he will give us a general introduction to the constitutional process, where it comes from, what's going on, and what will be taking place in the next days in Chile. Hello, Luciana, and thank you for this presentation. Thank you for organizing this event and for all of the work that you do in Nemati and the Legal Empowerment Network, that we're very proud to form part of this network. Indeed, we believe, and we've made this clear in a variety of different ways, that law must be a tool that helps to build more just societies. And this is precisely one of the problems that we had and that we continue to have, but that we hope we can resolve in Chile. One of the causes that led us into the present process. I can talk a bit more about that because I've been assigned 5 minutes to try to say this very briefly. I'm going to speak slowly enough for the translators to be able to translate adequately. Everyone that knows me knows that I usually speak at a mile per minute, but we can set the beginning of this social process in the dictatorship itself. In the 1980s, specifically in 1980, a new constitution was declared, and this new constitution reflects in a very detailed way the social vision of those people that held power at that time. They were trained in neoliberal schools, specifically in the Chicago school, and the military. They held the highest power, and they had a vision of society as a society based on property that should be orderly, in which the state should have very little to say relative to private enterprise in all fields, and that social rights are a matter of choice, but did not reflect social rights, and in which the order should be protected in a sufficiently powerful way that it couldn't be changed by those that would come after. Those are the words of the ideologue of this whole constitution. He recognizes that this constitution was established in order to impede change. Now, when we come to the period of democracy in 1989, returning to democracy meant taking down some of the most authoritarian aspects of that constitution, broadening over time. But despite the fact that in the 30 years between the return to democracy and the present, while some of the most authoritarian aspects of the Constitution were taken down, the principal structure was maintained. The structure that has shaped our present day society as a society that is especially neoliberal, orderly through the hierarchical devices I mentioned before. And so this has generated an array of concern from all different levels in terms of environmental protection, health, education, various social rights. And this has generated quite a number of powerful social movements that have been demanding change. But, and here is where law became a tool for blockage rather than a tool for change. And this is something that all social movements have confronted. Despite the capacity and intelligence within the social movements, in order to move the things along, the structures, changes within the structure were until now impossible. So this generated a greater and greater social frustration, expressed in very intense social inequality in terms of the distribution of wealth. Chile is one of the most unequal countries in the world, as well as certain legal structures that are, there are some legal positions which are intensely protected and others that are very underprotected. For example, those who have a lot of property find their rights very intensely protected. The law plays in the favor of protecting that of protecting that private property, but it does not promote environmental protection, community protections, etc. Environmental protection, especially in those territories outside of the big cities, in which there's a very uh, increasing concern about, for example, access to water, which in Chile is a private property and not a common good. Likewise, issues of extraction, like the forest industries, mining industries, etc., together with our constitution, which is hierarchical and based on private property. Uh, this constitution also protects the industrial status quo of Chile, uh, run by people in very significant positions of power. So Chile, in terms of its income, has grown greatly in the last 30 years. That doesn't mean a variation in the kind of economic activities that are protected by the Constitution, and therefore a continued emphasis in extractive industries that have caused such terrible environmental harm. I don't know how they're going to translate this, but this abuse towards people on the part of those that are in position of authorities, like saying, for example, that pollution uh, of heavy metals and volatile chemical materials in a industrial area, the principal reaction of a public representative of the company uh, uh, responded to complaints and health issues, saying that this couldn't be from the industry. It must be pollen from the trees to which people are allergic. So that's just an example of the kind of disdain towards public demands on the part of industry. In 2019, there was a collapse of the in Santiago. There was a social explosion in which the enormous majority of people living in Chile came out to demonstrate against a system that the majority considers unjust, and this generated a uprising throughout the whole country. The only way to move that along politically was to create a constitution building process. This is a process that didn't immediately calm the response. There's been a pandemic in the meantime, but this process has led or sort of channeled that energy into this process. It's also a political achievement that this process has been in throughout has been equal in terms of representation, of 50% representation of women and of men. It's been incorporated independent forces, so there are not only major political parties present, but also a number of regulatory changes in order to be able to include uh, independent political forces. 50% of the delegates to the constitutional process are people that are coming directly out of social movements, and particularly environmental and ecological movements, and representatives of the indigenous people, the original populations, which today also hold 17 different delegate seats. within this framework, the horizon is ecological, it's complex, establishing an ecological constitution, one that puts the protection of the environment at the very center of, and seeks to regulate the relationship between society and nature, is revolutionary in itself. It changes the way in which constitutions are understood in the Western world, in which the environmental issue is at the very most a right that might get mentioned, but our habitat does not appear as a central element to this. So this is something that we believe is we see ever more probable in this process that we might really achieve a ecological constitution. Part of our strength is that we understand the protection of the future and of the environment as essential to the future of our people. We are grateful to these movements. I'd specifically like to thank Gloria, Elisa, and Luis, who are with us today, and I think they will be providing very key elements to understand this process for all of us.
Por darnos un marco para entender el proceso que están pasando en Chile, de dónde viene y la historia que tengo la... vamos a empezar antes de
Let's start. Before starting the conversation, let me introduce the constituents that are with us today. Then we'll open a round of conversation, but let's first tell you who are with us today. We count with Elisa Iskanovich. She's an engineer, a feminist, and a constituent elected by the 28th district of Magallanes. She belongs to civil society for climate action. Also, Luis Jimenez, he's a lawyer from indigenous community, and he's an elected constituent for the Aymara people. Also, Gloria Alvarado, former president of the National Commission for Drinking Water and secretary for drinking water and manager of water cooperative in Patagua, Cerro Ichadegua community. She's a constituent for the 16th district, belongs to the people's list. Also, we had as an invited Aloja Carrillo. She's a member of the Feminist Coordination 8th of March, but she couldn't make it. But if you have any question for her, you can write it on the chat and we may go on with the conversation afterwards in our forum. About the advances of the feminist movement in the Chilean constitution. Before the round, I'm going to ask our guests if you may introduce yourselves briefly, which movement do you belong to, and also on personal terms, your participation into this process and how this constituent process is changing your lives and the movements you belong to. So 2-3 minutes, each of you. Elisa, Luis, Gloria. Okay, first say hello. Thanks for the invitation, for this chance to share with you the situation we're living in Chile. I'm gonna first tell you I'm from Magallanes region, south of Chile, the rebellious Patagonia. I participate in the feminist coordination of Punta Arenas. We are articulated with several feminist networks in the whole region and the whole country. We've been several years acting on accompanying networks with women subject to gender violence, also workshop about awareness on gender issues and also on other issues about so many abuses on human rights because of being women that affect us and also in a deeper way. From that standpoint, and with the organizations we support, when the constituent process started, first it was a destituent process, we started organizing as a society very spontaneously. It seems like something intrinsic to a human being to gather together when you have crisis situation. We started to build assemblies and parliaments. Here we built the feminist parliament of rebellious Patagonians. It went for a year. And we wrote a program about the constitution we needed. From that on, this initiative of building a list was something unavoidable because we thought that we had to bring our own voice to that constitution. So an electoral list was organized, an independent list from the social organization into that large platform, which is Social Coordination of Magallanes, with several organizations of the region. And we started a collaborative program, a common program coming from the mandate of the communities in the region that supports the systematization process of all the conversation we had in the parliaments and assemblies. So we're really committed to this process with the promise to open up spaces to citizens' participation for these times. Thank you, Lisa. Luis. This good morning in Aymara, brothers and sisters. I am a constituent, Aymara constituent. I'm really thankful for this invitation, listening to the rest of constituent sisters. As far as I'm concerned, we may say that the issue of the Aymara people has concerned me since I was a child because of the issue of transmission of culture and wisdom of our grandfathers, my grandmother, for instance, and since I was a young boy, I participated in several Aymara groupings, not just political, but also cultural dancing groups, for instance, folklore, like those dancing groups going to the communities. Then I went into university. I'm from Arica, the region of Arica. And then I went to Santiago, the capital. It's a personal process of rediscovering because of discrimination, exclusion, you get away from your communities. But at Santiago, I met different Aymara organizations and I rediscovered our identity. I really got involved with communities, associations, stressing on the fact that even though our ancestral territories are in the countryside, we do culture in the city. That's the idea of the Aymara jurisdiction in Santiago. I went then back to the territory and I started to get into the rights of indigenous people and the environment. So I've been studying different cases. There's some problem with the video. In this particular case, Since then, when we originally we had several mobilizations, especially in Arica. We had lead pollution, the arriving of big mining. It's the same logic, these environmental conflicts. And since then, I started to meet people. I realized that this was the moment to claim still difficulty with the video. Also after the arrival of democracy and the Aymara people, together with the several organizations, we started meeting each other in the marches, discussion. We are very diverse people, but most of the people the we're having problem with your audio. If you switch off the camera, maybe we're gonna listen to you better. We had some the institution has a difficulty to recognize us as political side. Our hope now is that the new constitution, together with the originary nation in the Chilean constitution, will allow us to overcome extractivism. We are very hopeful about this new period. We don't have a common organization, but there's several communities. We know each other. We want to contribute and have to this process from our territories and the recuperated territory that would be Santiago and Valparaiso. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Luis. Gloria. Hello, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this activity, in this event. I'm from a rural community from O'Higgins region. I work in a water community, water cooperative. After 40 years old, as a young woman, I couldn't study. I started studying a technical degree with a lot of effort. And besides my work into the water community in 1999, we had the first threat of privatization of the cooperative and rural water communities. Those communities and cooperatives supply water for the rural people. In the urban sectors, it's corporations that do it, but in the rural countryside, it's as we do that. We had the first threat of privatization, so it brought us to associate together among leaderships of the grassroots communities in order to form second-level organizations to protect this kind of community management, protecting the operational territories and defend us from privatization. We had to do all that work, but since we were provincial originary organizations, we had to gather together as an only national organization. So we created the National Federation of Drinking Water in the Countryside to negotiate with the government as an only voice, as a one and only voice. We had a national representative. We started to work with the government to write a bill on water in the countryside that was then discussed in the Congress. We participated into the whole process in the first day. And then it was passed. We started working on the rulings, on the regulations. It was a big effort. We hadn't any money. We had some international support. That's the way we could finish our work. We not just had that threat, but we have a water crisis in Chile. For 10 years, our drinking water services have been affected, several of them. As you said it, there are several areas that are really in a complicated situation. They are being supplied with trucks, water trucks. And during the pandemic, it's even more difficult, the water supply. So that's the way we see that there is an unfairness and justice in terms of water distribution. We know that we have this climate change, which is worldwide, but here in Chile, we don't have any functioning water supply with of use and consumption of water. So that's why we as national leadership and also at the grassroots, I've been elected to be a constituent during this period in order to into this predicament, do something more for the water in the countryside in Chile, because we are really concerned about this. We share with the agribusiness, we are into a competition, and that's where we are
We're
cornered.
further driven into the corner because we can't compete in terms of use. The wells that we can draw from are obviously much smaller than those that the agro-industry draws from. So all of this has motivated me and I've been nominated to be a delegate in the Constitutional Council. And I truly hope to be a good representative and work towards the greater good for Chile. So I'm delighted to share this space with my companions in this process. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gloria, Elisa, and Luis. It's amazing how all of this process from one day to the next has completely changed your lives. And you find yourselves leading this incredibly historical process in Chile. So in order to motivate those that are with us to start throwing out questions, and I'm going to introduce two different colleagues from other regions so that they can provide a perspective and a vision from entirely different perspectives and contexts outside of Chile, can enter into conversation with you and offer up a few questions. So we have Sara Hussein with us. She's a lawyer in Bangladesh. She has a long trajectory working in issues of gender-based violence, access to justice in Bangladesh, and a member from the very beginning in this network for legal empowerment, and also Marlon Manuel, who is also holds a part in the section on social justice, working with communities and especially indigenous communities in their struggle to access their rights and improve their situation. So Sara and Marlon will throw out a couple of initial questions. Please remember, in order to be able to hear the translation, don't forget to activate the interpretation channels. Please go ahead, Sara.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to be able to see you all and speak to you, and huge congratulations on the moment you're all in Chile, and thank you for the inspiration that you're giving to all of us. I'm speaking from Bangladesh, a country that's 50 years old and celebrating our 50th anniversary of independence after a liberation war. We got our constitution in a very short period of time, in 9 months, and it was made through a very speedy process, very different from yours, because there was a kind of moment of national consensus at that time. I'm really interested in knowing how you are going to rework and refashion a new constitution with such a diverse group of people. And my questions were, what kinds of processes, all of your being there, of course, is a huge part of an inclusive process already. But my question was, how will you build an inclusive conversation in designing this new conversation? And will you be looking at the experience of other countries in Latin America and beyond Latin America? And a third connected question on process, how will you deal with views which are opposed to change? How are you thinking of incorporating that? And I had a second question for you, which was around the issue that's very important for us in Bangladesh, and I think for all of us globally at this moment, is around the question of equality. And all of you are coming to this from particular groups and particular communities and particular interests. So my question was, how, again, are you thinking of addressing the question of equality in relation to all of the very different groups and communities, and particularly where sometimes there are contestations between different groups? One particular conflict I wondered about how you would address is issues between the right to equality and the right to freedom of religion. Is that an issue in your context? Does the right to freedom of religion, does the church inhibit, full articulation of the right to equality? And what are you thinking about that? Really looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Muchas gracias, Sara. Creo que para no perdernos las preguntas, que son varias.
In order not to get lost in your questions, I think we'll have a round right now of responses because Sara threw out quite a number of different questions. So we'll respond briefly to Sara's before taking Marlon's questions, looking at the question of equality in the Constitution, issues of religion. So please, if you'd like to respond, please go ahead and jump in. The microphone is open to whoever would like to speak. I'll start. This is very interesting what you ask. I think there are things that some of them will have to confront through the characteristics of the process that we've opened up. This is a process that's taking place on the basis of massive participation with millions of people in the street. This is not a process that's taking place from a constitutional perspective. This is an original constitutional moment that's been declared from social movements, from indigenous communities, and the demand from all of these quarters is to respect that process, to respect its times, and the tools of active participation of the citizenry. For example, linking all of the deliberation that's taking place in the parliament, in the delegation, etc., in all of the different spaces of deliberation, make sure that they're connected at every moment to the conversations in the street. We've been talking in many different groups in order to be able to defend this process in terms of its internal ways of organizing it. This permits us to guarantee tools of citizen participation, access to information, transparency, and the connection between different communities in this ongoing process. And this is sort of the institutional debate. But taking into account the popular character of this constitutional process in which millions of people are in the street self-organizing in spaces of conversation and deliberation, we're also saying that we want to work from the inside and also from the outside. We want to surround this conversation. This has been very clear for people coming out of social movements. We know that the Constitution is not a legal document, it's a political document, essentially, and it responds to the needs and the concerns and the demands that emerge from the people, from the communities. There are urgent issues. There's a whole context that in our country is being imposed by the Constitution, as Ezio explained, of a constitution written under the dictatorship that generates an enormous structures of abuse, injustice, and inequality, in which the protection of private property is put over and above any and all other kinds of rights, like popular rights, community rights, environmental rights. It's amazing that we're talking in such an open way about consecrating nature as a subject of rights, of animals, of all the different elements of nature, that we can be having an open conversation about making that a subject of rights is really a breakthrough. So the monumental character of this constitutional process has allowed us to enter from these spaces, from movements, social and environmental movements, indigenous movements. We can come in with all of our stories, our resistances, our struggles that have been stretched behind us decades or even hundreds of years. This will endow this process with an incredible diversity of visions, of experiences. And therefore, the strategy must be one of meeting each other from the spaces from which we arise. And so Luis and Gloria and we've already been meeting for many meetings because we've been organizing this encounter. Those of us that come out of indigenous, feminist, environmental movements, we need to be able to bring all of our different demands together. We're talking about a good life, finding a harmonious ways of living, communities with ecosystems. We're gradually seeking out an equilibrium and a harmony. So there are many demands that are coming from very different environments, but the diagnosis is shared. We face a situation driven by extractivism that has a sacrificial attitude towards human life and natural life, and the lives of women. Hence, we bring in eco-feminist positions in which these lives are the invisibilization of care work. There's no social support or security for caregivers, and the whole perspective of valuing the work of care, also in the context of ecosystems. So there are many different elements that are coming together from very different sectors, and really our strategy is simply to support each other amongst ourselves in order to build ourselves as a great transformative bloc that can make sure these issues are present, both inside the delegation, the constitutional process, but also outside and surrounding those deliberative processes, because we know this has to move beyond the individual will and through a collective process. I will remind you that we do have translation. If you can speak slightly more slowly, that I'm not saying so much on your behalf, but I'm reminding myself, let's say. I'd like to continue. I'd like to mention highlighting the issue of indigenous people or the original populations. Thinking from a political and historical context, one might ask, why Chile? Why in Chile has there been such resistance to include the existence of the indigenous people and their rights? There are various different professors that talk about centuries of different constitutionalisms. There's a first cycle, like from 1982 to 87, in which the Latin American constitutions talk about cultural diversity in plurilingual structures within a centralized state government. So that, for example, is the paradigmatic one. There is the Guatemalan constitution. Also, the Nicaraguan constitution talks about autonomous regions, or the possibility of autonomy for certain regions for the original populations. Then comes a cycle that we might call pluricultural constitutionalism, with the paradigmatic examples of Colombia and Mexico and Peru. The principal characteristics of these constitutions is the reaffirmation of the right to cultural identity and the right to culture. And while moving forward in the rest of the catalog of rights, this is an incipient possibility of political representation. This is the cycle of multiculturalism. And this is the model that Chile probably would embrace, or would have embraced under Michelle Bachelet. She was talking about a multicultural Chile. But given all of the resistances that from all of these different places, there is racism that has still not been overcome. It's very covered. And I think that also takes place with sexual diversities and the role of women. No one says it out loud, but it's present in daily life. And recognizing the rights of the original populations in a serious way requires changing the extractive economic system. So now we're entering the cycle of plurinational, for example, in the Constitution of Ecuador or Bolivia, that talk about refounding the state and put an end to internal colonialism. This situation in Latin America, how does it move forward? The strategy of the indigenous people originally was, in a first moment, was to ally with mainstream political parties. And in this situation, various different leaders was the alliance with the then candidate Elwi, and he committed to a series of constitutional reforms and an issue that was very much in vogue at that time was development. So and this worked to some extent. There was gradually it was ratified the rights of indigenous people. There was never a constitutional recognition, but there were some small advances. But it came upon a limit. It was not capable of introducing structural changes in order to alter the extractivist economic model based on the exploitation of ancestral lands. So gradually, the indigenous peoples became disenchanted with this strategy and have moved on to another one. Pushed forward in relationship with social movements, as Elisa mentioned, we need to continue to support each other. There's a great disenchantment with political parties that we've been feeling since the mid-1990s. I think that this structural pathway, there's a lot of resistance, there are even conflicts within the different movements. We're coming out of different places, different histories. Until now, however, it's gone well, and I have great hope in this regard, because the issue of the indigenous peoples in Bolivia, for example, when they've joined with leftist parties, we become the sort of the caboose, the last car on the train. And I think this is a new pathway that's opening up before us right now, a truly grassroots movement, and seeing how young people are joining social movements and creating these alliances. This allows us to work on the sort of metaphorical structure that we need to advance towards a common horizon. We need strong mechanisms of citizen participation, the recognition of indigenous peoples as autonomous community. And I look forward to walking towards this common horizon with all of these different sectors. Thank you, Luis. There are various different questions that are being asked. So if we can make the responses, we'd like to be able to respond to as many questions as possible. So Gloria, please go ahead, and then Marlon will ask his question. Of course. The question is whether you have looked at experiences and how are we going to confront those who oppose change and the issue of equality. So in terms of experiences, we have certainly been looking at, in a comparative way, at experiences from other countries, not in order to copy them exactly, but to adopt them, to try to understand what we can learn from them and what might serve us in this new constitution. So we're looking quite a lot at these texts, and we're also deeply immersed in the academy, in NGOs that are providing us with information. We have an ongoing and very active communication with the communities. This was a participatory process in which the communities must have a very important role, because the idea is that we be able to pick up all of their demands and build a constitution from the bottom up. So this is what we're doing. And we're going to give a lot of emphasis to the idea of the cabildos or synods. So what will we do about those who oppose change? Well, this is where we need to appeal to dialogue, have a horizontal conversation in such a way that we all respect each other and we all incorporate everything that we've collected, all of the voices of the citizenry, among all of us, that will be working together to elaborate this Magna Carta for our country. It's a very diverse group, it's true. There are different independent regions, indigenous peoples. It will be difficult to have this conversation, but we're going to have to bring it to a safe harbor, because this is the future of Chile that we're building. With regard to the question of equality, the present day constitution designates that we are all free with equal rights. But this is something that doesn't provide any guarantees. With regard to health, for example, it guarantees access, but it does not provide means in order to make that effective. So for there to be real equality, the state has to be able to guarantee those rights. So it needs to be established in this way. We note that there are recommendations in different international instruments with regard to equality. The Charter of the United Nations, for example, speaks about non-discrimination and declares equality as a right for men and women, and non-discrimination on the basis of sex, color, caste, religion, etc. So we need to make use of all of these different international instruments in order to be able to build the Chilean caste. So we talk about the human and inviolable human dignity. This is a clear mandate for. So this more or less, we're looking at an equality of rights that there are privileges now for some and a tremendous degree of inequality. So we don't, in terms of money, we don't all hope to have the same amount, but we do all deserve to have our rights respected and observed. And with the reflection of Elisa on ecological concerns, we require protection for our nature. This is essential because it is the foundation of life itself. Thank you, Gloria. We're going to pass the floor now. We have a question for each one of you, so whoever would like to respond, please go ahead, okay? And then we'll turn to questions from the audience. Marlon, please go ahead.
Thank you, Luciana, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I would say it's very interesting to hear the experience of Chile and to hear the excitement of the delegates, Elisa, Gloria, and Luis, because our situation is totally the opposite of what you have in Chile. If your constitution was the product of an authoritarian government, our current constitution was a product of the struggle against the dictatorship, against Marcos. So it was the fundamental document that opened up the country, opened up a new democratic government, new democratic space. And my question is about that. Unlike you in Chile, we are not excited about attempts to amend our constitution. In fact, many civil society organizations have opposed previous attempts to change the constitution because we see those attempts as potential openings for the progressive provisions in the current constitution to be removed or to be weakened. We have a whole chapter on social justice and human rights. We have provisions that gave rise to social justice legislation. This is my question. Are there specific provisions in your current constitution that you think should be preserved and protected and should be carried over, should be copied to the new constitution? Or is it really a total, is it you want to abandon the whole document? I would like to understand that from you. Thank you.
Great question. Ay, perdón. Una pregunta increíble. Como quién quiere empezar?
Fantastic question. Very interesting. Who would like to begin? So we have lots of possible responses. So whoever would like to begin, please go ahead. Thank you. Lucia, since you included me, I'm going to volunteer to respond. Look, here's my vision, at least. The 1980 Constitution has some democratic minimums that are sort of international standards, human rights, at least some of them, that will probably be maintained. Okay, there's the right to light, for example. Okay, we're going to maintain that. So, but the whole structure that has to do with legal structures, the effective legal and economic structures, from my perspective, they all need to be modified. That doesn't mean that each and every norm is going to be. So issues like, I don't know, the protection of persons or certain administrative things, certainly some of those things can be maintained. Something that could be maintained, for example, an organ that controls the legality of the organs of the state. Okay, that could be maintained. So there are probably some structures that may be maintained, but the real meat of the issue, like the most substantial parts from the vision of the social movements and from my own perspective, the bulk of it would have to be modified. Anyone else? If you agree, we can just move on. Gloria, please go ahead. As was already indicated, the Constitution written in 1980 is over 40 years old, so it's outdated. The Constitution should be the mirror of who we are, and this is no longer the case. In addition to what Ezio says, certain elements are conserved, like the right to life, things like that. But the substantial parts really do have to be changed. For example, there's nothing written about nature or the protection of ecology. It's essential that we protect, for example, all of the sources of water that arise out of the mountain range. This is the rivers and the aquifers are the veins of the earth itself. They're being contaminated at the source, and overdrawn at the source. And all of the millions of people living in this area can't possibly develop their own subsistence activities because of that intervention in the water cycle. So at an ecological level, we have to be able to have an ecocentric vision and enshrine that in the Constitution in a way that protects the commonwealth. So, and this necessarily intervenes in the economic model. We have to shift towards a model that protects elemental natural elements more completely. If we extract these materials, they can never recover themselves. So we must take this into account. I think there's maybe we lack knowledge or empathy in order to really understand what the extractive industries are doing to these regions. The natural elements can recuperate, but only if they're not overexploited and destroyed. So this must be limited, as well as many other rights that are not being guaranteed in the current constitution. Healthcare in Chile is currently extremely precarious. The state has shifted responsibility for health onto private entities, so those who have money can afford health and those who don't. Likewise with education and lots of other rights that's
that we
very
have to
important to
protect and
and
guarantee.
guarantee.
That's why we need a clean slate about that issue, so we can count on the voice of the people. It was written during the dictatorship. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Please briefly, so we can pass to the audience questions. Luis, did you raise your hand? It is a very good question because that's where I say that we agree on transversal common issues, but there may be different differences. What would I keep from the Constitution? The name, but that's a joke. But for instance, autonomous constitutional organs, the accounting court, the autonomy of the central bank. If it had worked okay, some changes about accountability. Another would be the rules for transparency and accountability. Another modification would be the fact that the 80 Constitution should add some chapter on social rights, and I would make a distinction between the clauses of the former Constitution, the 1925 clauses, because they are the best version about the rule of law, constitutional model. This is about the building of consensus, but we should pick back the rules about consensus coming from 25 Constitution. And another issue is about the right to live without pollution. We should advance about this because the mere guarantee of the right doesn't work in practice because it is defeated by the rights of property. So we should pass from this right to the, like Elisa and Gloria said, to a real recognition of the rights of the motherland that had to have an expression about the design of the institutions and the decision-making organs. Thank you, Luis, Elisa. Very short. I agree with what you have said, Gloria, Ezio, Luis. I'm just worried about what Marlon says. If you had a good constitution that is guaranteeing human rights, social rights, and they want to modify, they surely want to follow the neoliberal lines about profiting from people. I think you should take a look at Chile. If you want to become what Chile has been during this 30 last year, you see the results of those neoliberal policies. I think that there are things that we may and we must protect. We must advance along the lines of participatory democracy, the protection of ecosystems, the participation of communities, so recognition of the challenges of the 21st century, water crisis, uh, climate crisis. So the constitutional frame should advance along those lines and not uh, towards even more neoliberal trends, like Marlon says, that it's happening in his country. Thank you, Elisa. We have 15 minutes to try. We'll try to answer just one question each of you, even Ezio. So one question and answer for each one of you. First, is interesting for Luis is about the participation of indigenous communities in the Constitutional Convention. This is an incredible step forward that has quotas for indigenous communities. But the question is, how can you ensure the continuation and deepening of the participation of the indigenous people in the decision-making processes and the constituent process? But then the decision-making, the application, the implementation, how can the indigenous people be guaranteed, ensure that they will have a real say? A great question, and try to answer it briefly. So the reserve, the guaranteed seats, we interpret that as a recognition of the fact that Chile is a plurinational country, and that plurinationality has to be manifested in the very rulings of the Constitutional Convention. As an originary people, we are working about the participation and consultation mechanism, specifically to guarantee what we call constitutional plurinational deliberation. The important issue here is regardless of the mechanism, they should be institutionalized into the constitutional text, should be flexible enough to be adequate for every people, because we also have our differences about that. So, thirdly, I would say that sufficient budget should be guaranteed, and this has to be done seriously. The workings in our communities should have a real reflection, a real dialogue, a real binding consequences. Like I was saying at the beginning, there is already a great deal of work since a long time already done, as we as Aymara people, we see with a lot of concern what is going on with the Aymara people in Bolivia and Peru. We know that we won't get everything, but at least the necessary thing, the change of the extractivist model, maybe just not including the privatization clause on common goods, that would be already an achievement. But the next Congress, and I'm wrapping up, the next Congress that will write the bills and everything, we must pay attention about that. Use our resources as indigenous people. They should take into account our point of view in the writing of the laws. That's our great challenge now. Thank you, Luis, for your answer. Many questions already. We were not going to be able to answer all the questions, but maybe then we will connect with you to go on answering writing questions, writing answers. Another issue is about the common effort with many countries in the region. And about this, your look about other constitutional processes in Latin America and the efficacy they have into reality, then do you have any assessments about the efficacy of the constitution when it comes the time of putting them into practice? Several regions in the region have had constitutional changes. Which kind of hope do those constitutional constituent processes give us? And I'm going to link this question with a short question for Lisa, a shorter question about Rafaelos Reyes asked about the participation of LGBTQ community into the constituent process. Have they had any kind of participation about this? First question. I think that actually the compare experience of our brother countries is really valuable in order to include new visions of things we may include into our new constitution, also learnings from mistakes and things that have been excluded. For instance, the extractivist model, in spite of the fact that nature is recognized as a subject of rights, hasn't been really changed in countries like Peru and Bolivia. Along this line, it's going to be really important to deepen the discussions about this, see what can we do at the engine hall. I understand the need to enter into that organic part of the constitutions in order to give powers to the state about this issue, about what we are denouncing in our claims. It shouldn't be just a poetic text about the rights of nature and everything, but actually, really, we're going to create an agency, an ombudsman for the nature. We're going to consecrate human rights to water and like a national good, a public use good. We must be very explicit about that organic part in order to have a defense, a shield. It's not just about protection, but also deepening the discussions about rethinking the productive economic model, developmental model. We shouldn't hope really preservation and regeneration of the sacrificed ecosystems for corporate profit and economic development. We cannot hope that if we don't rethink how do we sustain the economy. If it is gonna be working for the big capital, it's not gonna be effective. Economy should put life at the center. If we're going to speak about the central bank, which is the vision, is the economic capitalist neoliberal vision, it's not going to be useful for that. That kind of autonomy is not going to be working. This is the time to rethink everything. We are living a moment in Chile when we have that chance to propose here and to the world an alternative model in a context of deep crisis like we're living now. So diverse social local economies thinking into a post-capitalist period. Thank you, Elisa, for your answer. I'm trying to associate several questions for Ezio about the organic part of the Constitution. How can we make effective the discussion? There is a question about accountability of private actors. Do you have any chapter about accountability, environmental accountability? Do you have any open discussion with social movements about access to justice, integrate access to justice and the independence of the judiciary? Is it into the Constitution? Questions about the modification of the organic part, about the efficacy, effectivity of rights, about access to justice. I think that Elisa already gave some first idea about this, about the generation of the creation of a nature ombudsman, so to say. And also she referred to something that has to be reviewed. This is a question that may make the organic difference for the future. The autonomous constitutional agencies, but the discussion is about the possible future generation of autonomous agencies through legal norms. We don't have that now, contrary to many countries in the world. So all agencies depend on the presidency of the republic. So sometimes they are captured for private interests. They don't fulfill their role. So we are discussing about the environmental assessment agency and the Commission for Environmental Surveillance. They should have autonomy to do the work with a legal mandate and not being controlled by the executive power, who is gonna exert pressure on them. So about the efficacy of rights, besides having agency that make that rights something specific real, they have two keys: not to allow concentrate power to one agency. That was the problem of the Ecuadorian constitution. So the rights of nature wouldn't really be recognized. At that point, Rafael Correa didn't believe into the rights of nature. We should take this into account. The second thing that may be important along these lines is the after the constitution, how the real democratic power may
can continue
go
to
on
be
manifesting
manifest. So this
itself.
question of justice is one of the variables, the access to information. These are all elements that are necessary in order for people to, irrespective of whether they're whether there's a prime minister, a presidency, or a parliament, or whatever. But in order for people to continue to have a democratic commitment, to continue to participate or be represented through in representative structures or in territorial organizations, neighborhood organizations, etc. And in that sense, on the one hand is the defense of nature, but also we need to have popular voices that allow people to access tribunals of justice when their rights are violated or when they're not adequately protected. Right now, only the violations of liberty is being taken to court or to the tribunals, but we propose that that they also be that also include the failure to protect rights. The Constitution has a list of those things which are public, which the Constitutional Tribunal has opposed to the law and said, because the Constitution says that these are public things, therefore everything else is not a public thing. Because while the law broadens access to information, specifically, for example, with the salmon industry, though we should rather depart from the perspective in which everyone is working with the common goods of nature, and so and work from there, understand that everything by default is common. I think we could be here for hours discussing this issue. It's extremely interesting, both the process and the proposals that you're pushing forward in with regard to how to improve the Constitution. I'm very sorry that there are only 2 minutes left, so I'm going to end with a question for Gloria. How do these social demands, specifically of water as a common good, into the Constitution, and how do you hope or expect those to be translated into the Constitution? And we, as national and local and regional leaders, wish for water to be protected, specifically the sources, the aquifers, the subterranean waters. And water needs to be identified as an inappropriable common good that cannot be privatized, cannot belong to anyone, belongs to nature itself, and cannot be characterized by an economic value. It has a value of its own. So it must be considered a human right, a common good with a value of its own and with universal access to it. It's very important to protect the universal access to safe water. We need a better distribution of water in Chile, a protection and a regulation of access to this water and the protection of nature. Thank you very much. We have 1,000 questions more. I knew I was going to end up with more questions than I started, but thank you very much for your participation, Gloria, Luis, Elisa, Izio. We're going to continue following up on the process, sharing information. It's truly a hope-inspiring process. The singularity of this moment in Chile is how it was begun, the trajectory, the past that Elisa cited, the history of this constitution, and the incredibly powerful change driven by social movements and indigenous peoples is tremendously inspiring for all of the rest of us. So thank you very much. We look forward to continuing to share information with everyone that's participated, and please, however we can support or help you as the network of legal empowerment, we're very happy to provide this. We need to provide international support, so please count on that. Thank you for giving us this moment to talk to you. We are going to continue this conversation in our forum, and thank you very much, Sarah, Marlon, and everyone that wrote in questions into the chat. Thank you very much, and we will continue to meet. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you. Goodbye.